So many years ago, when my kids were still quite young, I think my daughter Daryl was about 7 years of age. My son Dylan would have been about 10. Beth and I took them on a family vacation to Mount Washington in New Hampshire. Any here been up Mount Washington? A couple people, maybe some of you online. Mount Washington, I believe, is the highest point on the East Coast. It's 6,200 plus feet high. It's a very high mountain. I know for those of you who are worshiping from the West Coast or out near the Rockies, that maybe that's a little bump in the earth for you all, but on the East Coast, that's a very high mountain. It's a bald mountain, one of those mountains that trees don't grow that high and in that kind of cold temperature, at least not many of them. I remember we pulled the car up to the little kiosk at the bottom of the mountain. That's where you pays your money. I don't remember whether we had to pay $10 or $20 to take a carload up to the top of the mountain. And when you pay your fee to go into the park or go up the mountain, they hand you a little clipboard with a waiver on it that you have to sign that basically says if anything happens to you when you're up on top of the mountain, if you slip and fall or drive over the edge of a cliff, it's not their fault. Don't blame us. You signed the waiver. Well, Beth and I are not the types just to put our signature on any contract without reading it first. So when they handed us the clipboard with the waiver through our driver's side window, Beth and I kind of leaned in to the center of the front seat together, and we began to read this waiver together, just looking through the points. What are we really signing here? And at one point, I looked in the rearview mirror, and I see my two kids, my daughter and my son. They're leaned in and looking over our shoulder with a kind of look of concern on their faces as they're reading this disclaimer. My son says, "Dad, if you've got to sign a waiver to go up the mountain, maybe this isn't such a good idea that we do it." We said, "It's okay, Dylan." We reassured him. It's a sort of a matter of course. Everybody's got to do it. They do it all the time, and we'll be extra careful up there. So we signed the waiver, handed it back through the car window, and we began driving up the mountain. It's quite pretty in the lower part of the mountain. There's trees, and it's a lovely, smooth, paved road, and it's just kind of lovely being in the woods and that sort of thing. But when you get up around 3,500 feet or so, maybe 4,000 feet, you get past what they call the tree line, meaning trees aren't growing very high anymore. It's just sort of scrub bush, and even that, there's not much of it. It's mostly kind of gray stone, rock, and maybe little lichen and moss and grass growing, but nothing to block your view. In fact, the views starting at about 4,000 feet are spectacular. It's beautiful. You can see all these mountains from your car window. But the problem for me is when you get past 4,000 feet, the road switches from asphalt to gravel. And it gets narrower and narrower. And you're really on the edge of some really steep inclines and cliffs. And all of a sudden, I'm kind of white-knuckling it. I'm getting a little vertigo. It feels really... And how on earth these people with their RVs get up to the top of the mountain? But they do, because they're coming back down, and you got to kind of scooch over to the edge so that they can get by. And I'm starting to think, oh my gosh. I said, "Beth, listen, there's a little pullover area. It's not just enough maybe to pull your car to the edge for a moment, let people pass." I said, "Listen, I got a little bit of vertigo. I think I'm going to pull the car over. Do you mind if we switch? I'll go in the passenger side and you can drive." And Beth said, "No problem." So we pulled the car over to the edge, switched drivers. Now Beth's driving and I'm in the passenger seat. And as soon as we close the doors and sit down, I hear my son Dylan breathe this heavy sigh and then say, "I told you guys this was a bad idea." I'm thankful happy to report to you that we made it to the top of Mount Washington and back down without driving off the cliff. We are here today to pay testimony to that. Every year on this Sunday, Transfiguration Sunday, I think about Peter, James, and John trailing up behind Jesus up to the Mount of Transfiguration. I think about that story of the time my family and I went up Mount Washington. Because in my mind, I start to wonder if Peter, James, and John, scrambling over rocks, perhaps grabbing tree branches and roots, trying to make it to the top of Mount Tabor with Jesus, I wonder if at some point they turned to one another and said, "I told you guys this was a bad idea." Think about it. Peter, James, and John are not mountain climbers, are they? Peter, James, and John are what? Fishermen, right? They're like shrimpers from old Montgomery. They're used to spending their life in a kind of a low country, so to speak. In fact, not only did they spend the entirety of their lives at sea level, they spent much of their lives on the sea. Oh, they might have scrambled around the docks and things when they were kids, but by the time they were 7 or 8, their parents would have put them in the boat and said, "Come on, you're going to be casting a net and hauling in fish for like the rest of us. You're going to learn a trade." James and John, sons of Zebedee, they were fishing with their dad when Jesus called them. They were used to working under the bright light and the warmth of a kind of low country life near the sea. Or as we like to say down here in the south, there are days when the weather feels close, right? But we don't say it's humid out, or we don't say it's damp. We say the day feels close. They lived that kind of experience, not in the thin air, the high altitudes, the cold chill of a wind blowing across a mountain. That would be very foreign to them. And they've dropped their nets, they've followed Jesus, they've seen what Jesus can do, call out unclean spirits. He raised up Simon's mother-in-law. And now Jesus says, "Hey, fisher friends, pack up your old kit bag. We're going to go hiking in the mountains. We're going up Mount Tabor." Now that's the one that the scholars say is the likely Mount of Transfiguration. It's a pretty high mountain, 1,880 some odd feet high. Now, to put that in perspective, it's not a Mount Washington by any means. But to put it in perspective, the Empire State Building is 1,400 feet high. So Mount Tabor is at least 400 feet higher than the Empire State Building, 102 stories. In fact, a couple of years ago, Beth and I were in New York, and we went up the Empire State Building at night. And I was very glad they had an elevator, because I did not want to walk 102 stories up to that outdoor observation deck. And when we got out on that deck, the city below, it was midnight when we went, and all the lights were just sparkling below. For as far as we could see, they looked like the stars above us. It was just beautiful, spectacular view from that kind of height. And to put it in perspective for all y'all Canadians who are tuned in today, Canada's CN Tower, which was once the highest freestanding building in the world, just up to a few years ago, is almost as high as Mount Tabor, but it's still shorter by about 100 feet. I think the CN Tower is 147 stories high. They've got an elevator too, thank goodness. Y'all don't want to walk up 147 stories. And if you do, I know once a year they do this CN Tower run where people get to run and walk up those. And they have people standing by, of course, with the paddles, right? Because if you go 147 stories, that can be pretty stressful on yourself. I remember being up on the CN Tower once on their observation deck on a clear day. And you can see from Toronto all the way across Lake Ontario to Buffalo, New York from that kind of height. Just putting Mount Tabor into a little perspective, it's higher than the CN Tower. It's a big climb. And for those of you who live in Georgia, and those of you who've been here to visit, Mount Tabor is a lot like Stone Mountain. You know Stone Mountain, it's not one of those little rolling hills and peaks and valleys. It's this big bump in the middle of the earth. It's like it just rises up out of nowhere. And I would encourage you, not now if you're streaming, but later today, do a Google search for Mount Tabor. You'll see and you could do a Stone Mountain and Mount Tabor side by side. They look very much alike. 150 stories high worth of climbing, these bumps in the middle of the earth. So it's not like, they've taken these gradual hikes up to the top of Mount Tabor. There's a lot of steep climbing, incline climbing. As I said, Jesus and Peter, James, and John probably grabbing onto some tree branches and perhaps some rocks to help pull themselves up to the top of that mountain. These fishermen, in their sandals, are climbing to the top of this really high peak. I am guessing that one of them at some point was huffing and puffing and out of breath, their heart pounding so fast they could hear it pounding in their ears, maybe turned to the other and said, "I told you guys this was a bad idea." And when they get to the top, when they make it to the pinnacle of Mount Tabor, something remarkable happens, doesn't it? Something mysterious, something absolutely divine and inexplicable, although many have tried to explain what the Transfiguration was all about. I saw on a church leaders site the other day that maybe Transfiguration is sort of like when a person walks into a room, they light up the room. And maybe Jesus was one of those charismatic kind of characters. I don't know. That's not even close to what Mark and the other gospel writers say happened up there on top of Mount Tabor. They said when they got to the top of that mountain, Jesus was transfigured. He started to kind of glow with this bright light. It doesn't say whether the light was shining on him or out of him, but it said that his clothes became a dazzling white. And Mark is very careful to point out, whiter than any bleach on earth could make them. In other words, what is happening to Jesus here, or what is happening in this moment, is not an earthly experience. This is a divine experience. Jesus is transfigured. He's in a kind of glory, a radiant glory, this light shining on him, through him, out of him. And guess who shows up? A couple of dead guys, Elijah and Moses. Two of the major prophets that Jesus certainly would have known as a young man and as a student of the Torah, of the law, of the Judeo religion. But they've been dead for a long time. And here Peter, James, and John are watching this. Elijah and Moses show up. And you know what Peter, the blurter, says? Peter says, "Lord, it's good to be here." Well, of course it is kind of good to be there. The climb is over. That's done. But compared to what's going on down at the bottom of that mountain, the brokenness, the sinfulness, the sadness, the heartache down there in the world, it's good to be up there on that mountain. They're experiencing something of the glory of God. Something of the truth, the blessings of God up there on that mountain. It's good to be there. I don't know how you all feel on Sunday mornings. That's how I feel about coming to church. It's good to be here. You think about what's going on out there in the world on a daily basis. The mud and the muck that the people are stuck in, the mud and the muck that people sling at one another, the way the world tries to dehumanize us. The way the world wants to rob our identity, take it away from us, trying to make us forget that we are sons and daughters of God's creation. The world wants us to think that we're voters. We're consumers. We're taxpayers. We're a number on a form. We're a number in a system. But up there on the mountain, or when we gather here in worship, when we remember God's truth, when we lift up God's word, we remember who we are. We are the sons and daughters of God's creation. God created us. We are the brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ who reclaimed our life, who restores us. We are the people of the Holy Spirit, empowered and sustained by that Spirit. It's good to be here. I don't know about you, but I look forward to this time all week. And when I come back down from this mountain, I go home and I feel supercharged. I remember who I am. I feel blessed by being gathered together. It's good to be here. You know, my brother David, just a few years older than me, has been living with cancer for over 20 years now. David has lived with cancer. He's wrote about cancer. He travels around the country speaking about cancer. And David, when he comes out onto stage to speak, he begins by saying, "Thank you for having me today. It's good to be here." And people clap politely. "Yes, thank you for being our guest speaker today." And then he stops them. He says, "No, if you've been living with cancer for over 20 years, I really mean it when I say it's good to be here. Compared to the alternative, it's good to be here." I think Peter's experiencing something of that up there on that mountain with Jesus compared to what's down there in the mud and the muck of the world. He's much happier up there on that mountaintop with Jesus in the bright light of God's glory. It's good to be here. Although, you know, it's strange. The first thing Peter wants to do when he has this holy experience of God, do you know what do you remember? Did you notice what he wanted to do? What's that, Lewis?
Oh, sorry. Build a house.
Build a house. 3 of them, right? Lewis is a licensed lay pastor. I'm glad to hear from you. Peter wants to build 3 booths, if you grew up on the King James version of the Bible. 3 kind of worshiping sites, 3 churches, so to speak. He says, let's build 3 booths, one for you, Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And it cracks me up because I think, you know, what is it about us humans that every time we have a godly experience, something divine, we want to build a church. We want to build a mega church. Well, you know, we experience something holy and sacred and divine. We're like, well, let's plug it in. Let's build a building and have a big old drop-down screen and a rock and roll band. But Jesus never called us to do that. Jesus called us not to build a church, but to be the church. Jesus called us to be the church, the gathered, the ecclesia, the people of God. He didn't say go into the world and build churches. He said go into the world and proclaim the gospel, the good news of God's love and grace and mercy. Baptize people into a baptism of repentance and forgiveness. But Peter, he's like a lot of us. His first inclination is to think worldly thoughts. Let's build a booth, an Ebenezer, I think sometimes we call that. You remember, "Come thou fount of every blessing? Here I raise my Ebenezer." An Ebenezer is a worshiping place. Peter didn't just want to put a rock, a worshiping place. Peter wanted to build churches for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. But you know, you can't really blame him for wanting to stay on top of that mountain compared to what's down there in the world. And you can't blame him for wanting to build these booths, these churches, these houses that honor these, you know, divine beings, Jesus and the 2 great prophets, Moses and Elijah. You can't blame him for wanting to do that. In fact, Mark's gospel said Peter wasn't in his right mind. Mark says they were terrified. They were terrified. In fact, Mark says they didn't know what they were saying, for they were terrified. Imagine that. I don't know about you, but when I went to Sunday school as a kid, I remember my Sunday school teachers, not just one, but many of them at different times along my journey as a child, raising this question in Sunday school, saying, if you ever met Jesus, what would you ask Jesus? And it was a great little hypothetical question, but it never dawned on us kids, and it never dawned on our Sunday school teacher that maybe we wouldn't be the ones doing the talking. Maybe Jesus be asking us something. Never dawned on us that that we might be terrified in the presence of Jesus. Did it dawn on you when your Sunday school teacher asked you that? If you ever met Jesus? I never thought about being terrified, but that's the experience of Peter, James, and John. They were terrified. I've been doing a lot of thinking about why they were terrified. Certainly there was this inexplicable, glorious, holy moment happening. They were in the bright light of Transfiguration. But there's something else at play here, and Mark leaves us a real sharp clue, an indicator as to why they might be terrified. And it's right there in the second verse of chapter 9 of Mark's Gospel. Did you notice how he started this passage? He said, 6 days later, they went up the mountain. 6 days later. Now, why did Mark put that there, 6 days later? Why did he have to tell us? Why did he put it in a timeline? Well, if you flip back a page in your Bible to 6 days earlier, you know where you are? You're at Caesarea Philippi. And you're standing with Jesus and Peter and James and John at Pan's Grotto. Remember Pan's Grotto? That's that stone face, rock face by the water's edge. And in that rock face, there's a bit of a grotto, a little cave. And all around that little cave, there are niches carved into the stone. And people have put these stone and wood carvings of these kind of false gods, these other gods, Pan being one of them, into the stone, into the rock. They're not living like our living God. They are stone and lifeless. And they're there by Pan's Grotto. And Jesus says to them, who do people say that I am? You can almost see Jesus kind of pointing up to all these lifeless stone and wood gods in the niches at Pan's Grotto and saying, well, that's who they are. Who do people say I am? And they kind of debate among themselves for a minute. And they say, well, you know, some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're a prophet. Then Jesus makes it personal. He asks a question that I think every one of us needs to answer. Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And do you remember what Peter said? Peter said, you are the Messiah. You are the anointed. You are God's chosen one, the Holy One of God. He's professing his faith with his lips. He's stating what he has, through reason, come to believe about Jesus. He's had these experiences with Jesus, seen him raise up his mother-in-law, he's seen him call out the unclean spirits. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says to him, right, yes, you've answered perfectly, Peter. Simon at that point. He says, you've answered perfectly, Simon. From now on you shall be called Peter, which means rock. And upon the rock of your confession of faith, not the rock that's around, and not the rock of these stone gods, but upon the rock of your confession of faith, I will build my church. I'm not going to build it on stone. I'm going to build it in your confession of faith, in your hearts. And that must have felt pretty good to hear Jesus say that. Then Jesus says, but remember, he calls some other people around. He said, the Son of Man, the Messiah, must be handed over to the authorities, arrested, persecuted, and crucified, and raised on the third day, although they didn't really understand what that meant at that time. And you remember Peter says, no, say it ain't so, Lord. Let's do it another way. Let's bring salvation a different way. You shouldn't be arrested, persecuted, and crucified. Because you're good Southern Christians, Presbyterians, you know what Jesus said to Peter at that moment. He said, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your sights on things of this world and not things that are above. It must be this way. Any who want to follow me, let them deny themselves, pick up their cross, and follow me. 6 days later, they go up to this Mount of Transfiguration. And for the very first time, Peter, James, and John see with their own eyes what they've reasoned themselves to believe, what they've professed with their mouth, but now they know it's real. Their eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. There's no denying it now. There's no turning back. There is no doubt. And if Jesus is who he said he was, and if Jesus is who Peter proclaimed him and testified to him being, then everything else is going to be true as well. Indeed, the Son of Man will be handed over to the authorities, will be persecuted, will be crucified. And if they're going to continue following him, they need to pick up their cross and follow him as well. Mark said they didn't know what they were saying, for they were terrified. Can you imagine experiencing the bright light of Jesus Christ? Everything that the gospel says about Jesus, we know it's true. Well, the fact of the matter is we have experienced the glory of God, haven't we? Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out of vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. We sing, we proclaim, we know we've stood in the bright light, and so we ought to tremble somewhat with Peter and James and John at this transfiguration of Jesus. We might get a little nervous because after Jesus was transfigured, a voice from above came and said, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." And what's the first thing Jesus wants them to do? Follow him. Follow him back down the mountain and into the world where they might serve Jesus there by loving neighbors and welcoming strangers, by lifting up the downtrodden and caring for the poor and the hungry. The first thing they're called to do is go back down the mountain. You know, I think it's quite a blessing, isn't it, that we get to gather week by week, whether you're gathering online or in person these days, that we get to go to the mountaintop, that we have seen the glory of God, but we are also called to go back into the world, to come back down the mountain and re-enter the world where we might meet Jesus and love Jesus and serve Jesus by caring for neighbors and welcoming strangers, for walking with those who are in need, those who are hungry and homeless, those who have broken hearts. That's our first call, to go back down the mountain. You know, there's a wonderful book written a long time ago. They've made a couple of movies based on the book. It's called The Razor's Edge. The version I know is starred Bill Murray, the comedian, although this was not a comedy. Bill Murray plays this character who's been in the Second World War, and he comes home damaged. And I don't mean physically damaged, but emotionally, spiritually damaged. He's seen some of the worst ugliness of humanity that we could ever possibly imagine. And so in his kind of existential angst, he kind of throws away his life back here in America, and he starts traveling around the world in search of truth, in search of the meaning of life. And someone points him toward this monk who's living in Tibet at the foot of this mountain, at a Tibetan monastery. And he meets this monk, and he says, "Look, I'm searching for meaning. I'm searching for truth." And the monk says, "Look, here are a stack of books, and I want you to climb up to the top of the mountain. At the top of the mountain, there's a little shack where you can read and pray and fast and meditate until the meaning you seek, the truth you seek, is revealed to you." So Bill Murray's character climbs up this mountain. It's a brutal climb. It's tons of snow, much higher than Mount Washington and definitely higher than Mount Tabor. And he finds this shack up here in the frigid air of this mountain. He crawls in, he makes a fire, and for about a month, he does exactly what the monk tells him to do. He reads, he prays, he meditates, he fasts. And after about a month, you see him sitting there reading this book, and all of a sudden he does this. He slaps the book closed, packs everything up, and then trudges down to the bottom of the mountain, hands the books back to the monk. And the monk said, well, what did you learn? And Bill Murray said, I learned it's easy to be a holy man on top of a mountain. My call is to learn how to be a holy man, a good man in the world. Isn't that what's happening here on the Mount of Transfiguration? Jesus calls them back down the mountain and into the world so that with Jesus they might set their face toward Jerusalem, that they might pick up a cross and carry it with Jesus, that they might follow in his footsteps. It's easy to be a holy man on top of a mountain. It's good to be there. But as Christians, we who have seen the glory of God are also called to go back into the world where we might meet him and serve him there. The good news is we've seen the glory. We've been with Peter, James, and John to the mountaintop. We experience God's truth over and over again. We find our faith strengthened so that we can go into the world, so that we can live as people of faith each and every day. The blessing of the mountaintop is that it strengthens us, that we might live with the confidence of our faith each and every day. Friends, at the end of every worship service, or many, I often say, may God bless you with a warm heart, with open minds, and with imaginations full of wonder. And then I say, may God bless us with the confidence of a mighty faith, that we might embrace the days in which we live in. I believe that's what the mountaintop prepares us for. I believe that's what these moments of worship and celebration prepare us for. They strengthen us so that we might re-enter the world with the confidence of a mighty faith, that we might embrace the days in which we live. Praise be to God. Amen.